Care Bears, it's Haley here. Welcome back to another Royale High video on my channel. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe for daily Roblox videos. Anyways, in today's video, I wanted to talk to you guys about a problem going on and all the hate just happening in the Royale High community, but also just any dress-up game community. Royale High falls over the dress-up game genre. I mean, that's most of what you can really do in this game. It's just dress up, and you know, it's like an open world roleplay game, and a lot of other dress-up games are like that too. And there's just a lot of hate going on with Royale High being compared to all these other dress-up games that I want to talk about, and let's go ahead and get into it. Anyways, though, there's a lot of hate going on in the community, like I said, with dress-up games being compared to Royale High, because Royale High is one of the most popular dress-up games. I'm not gonna, specify which games are being hated on, because I honestly think there's just so many that are being hated on, and it's honestly crazy. And I know I made a video about 𝘾𝙧𝙚𝙪𝙩 not too long ago, and I'm not talking about 𝘾𝙧𝙚𝙪𝙩. I haven't seen many people compare 𝘾𝙧𝙚𝙪𝙩 to Royale High, but there is other games that I do enjoy that are constantly compared to Royale High, and I just don't think it's fair. So Royale High, I just want to say Royale High is not the first ever dress-up game to be created. There's been dress-up games all over the internet ever since I was little. Guys, I'm like almost 20, so let's say that, dress-up games have been around for over 20 years, okay? I mean, there used to be dress-up games on Barbie.com. There probably still is, I don't know. There used to be dress-up games on dressup.com. I remember that website. There were dress-up game apps. There were a bunch of websites just made for dressing up, and some of them also were open world too, like Royale High is. And now that there's other Roblox dress-up games being made, and Royale High is one of the most popular dress-up games right now, fantasy open world dress-up games, people are comparing Royale High to these games and saying that these games are copying, quote-unquote, copying Royale High, and I just don't think that's fair. Now, I don't think, every game that is a dress-up game doesn't copy Royale High. There are some copies of Royale High, like literally like model for model, like sometimes they steal models from Royale High, or they steal like items, but a lot of the items made in Royale High were not first ever created by Royale High. A lot of the items in Royale High were actually inspired by real life photos and like real life fashion. So to say, for example, a pleated skirt in any other dress-up game, even though Royale High has it, see this pleated skirt, saying that if another dress-up game has this pleated skirt and they're copying Royale High is a very far reach, because pleated skirts exist in real life. They don't need Royale High's permission to use a pleated skirt in their game, because Royale High just got the pleated skirt from real life. Like, a lot of Royale High's items are inspired by real life, and a lot of the developers have even said that as well. A lot of items are just not original thoughts, they're just inspiration from real life fashion, and that goes the same for any other dress-up game, not just Royale High. I think accusing a dress-up game of copying Royale High just because it has a skirt in the game that looks a little similar is just a very big reach, because Royale High already has said a lot of their items are inspired by real life and fashion they see in real life. So they're not really copying Royale High, they're just taking inspiration from real life as well. That's just one thing I wanted to cover. Another thing is just people saying any dress-up game just because it's fantasy themed is copying Royale High. There are so many games on Roblox that are mermaid themed, fairy themed, and they don't get accused of copying Royale High. But if it is mermaid or fantasy themed with dress up, then it's copying Royale High. Well, I don't think that's the case. It's just a genre, guys. I don't think the same genre as Royale High equals it's copying Royale High. I just don't think that's fair for the creators of these other dress up games and all their hard work being pushed down the drain just because people only are thinking about Royale High. I think we need to give other dress-up games a chance, in my opinion, at least to those of you who aren't giving it a chance. Just give it a chance and see if you enjoy it. Yes, it might not be just like Royale High, but Royale High has so many many years of experience compared to these other dress up games, because a lot of these dress up games are just now coming out. It's just Royale High is a little bit more popular. I don't blame you for thinking about Royale High when you play it, since Royale High is one of the most popular dress up games on Roblox right now, but I don't think you should negatively compare it. I mean, you can say, oh, this reminds me of Royale High, I like it, but saying it like they copied Royale High, it's just a little too much. Like, why are you making drama out of nothing? Like, I don't know. It's just a little weird that people are hating to this extent and just only wanting to play Royale High, even though there's other great fantasy, you know, dress up games out there, or just dress up games in general. It doesn't even need to be fantasy themed, but just any dress up game with a corset, heels, a skirt, just any of those items in the game, you should just give it a shot. I think it's gonna be great if you just try it out with an open mind, of course, because yes, these games may not be copying Royale High, but they might be inspired, since Royale High is the most popular game right now, but that doesn't mean they're copying. You know how many games there are that are inspirations of each other, just in real life in general and on Roblox? Like, so many games just reference each other because everyone is just so inspired. Making a game on Roblox, where just in general, is a form of art, and if you're an artist, you know, artists take inspiration from other artists, and I think that's fair. I really think that's fair. So guys, please stop the hate. If you are hating on any dress up games, give it a chance, and let's stop comparing others. You know, that's always been a bad thing to do. You're not supposed to compare others or compare yourself to someone else. So let's not do the same for games, and let's give these games a chance, especially since Royale High hasn't been updated recently. You can play these other games to fill the void of your boredom you're having right now, or just play them because you're interested. I just wanted to add this before I end the video. If you think I'm trying to like force you to play like these other dress up games, I am not trying to do that. I'm just trying to say, try to give it a chance before you start hating. And honestly, if you still think it's copying Royale High, I honestly just say, instead of sending hate to these games, instead just move on and don't play it, and stop giving these games attention if you don't like them. Just move on and play the games you enjoy, and let everyone else enjoy what they want to enjoy, and just move on. That's all I wanted to talk about in today's video. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for daily Roblox videos, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye, Care Bears!